solving the problems of doubling GDP and external convertibility of the ruble on the basis of new principles of its emission and circulation, the transition to an energy standard of backing of money, and the transition of exports into the ruble zone. The ways in which the state progresses, the actual things that make it thrive, and why for gold it need not strive, when basic products it possesses. Alexander Pushkin. After the presidential elections, a contradictory political situation took shape. Liberal Western ideas in politics have fully exhausted themselves, discredited in the eyes of the people, as evidenced, among other things, by the results of the elections to the State Duma, with which the president cannot but reckon. At the same time, the economic politics retains a clearly expressed pro-Western orientation towards the development of Russia as a raw material appendage. However, the country cannot effectively develop in the context of the implementation of two mutually exclusive lines. On the agenda, more acute than ever, there has arisen an issue of developing the unified conception of social safety, in which politics and economy are logically combined and condition each other, forming tendencies of crisis-free development. The crisis of our statehood is primarily conditioned by the inadequacy of sociological science to the realities of social life, and in particular, by the inadequacy of economic science, and as a consequence, by the absence of a methodology of governance towards the state and its prosperity according to the entire function. None of the economics textbooks even raise the question of the ways in which the state progresses. They teach the art of progressing within the framework of a single corporation, a bank, or an individual. However, in practice, the most effective corporative effect is achieved at the expense of others, i.e., at the expense of causing damage to the state and society as a whole. The country has all the necessary prerequisites for solving the tasks of the presidential address on the transition of the economy to accelerated rates of development and external convertibility of the ruble. We have a sufficient energy base, excessive raw materials, skilled labor, guaranteed domestic demand, but we do not realize these potential opportunities due to serious methodological errors. Our state does not implement governance towards goods-money relations in their interconnection, with the balance of interests of the financial sector and every one of the sectors of the sphere of production, with the balance of state interests and the interests of the global financial market and of the market of goods. Moreover, with the use of mass media, stable, destructive for the country stereotypes concerning the autonomy of the objectives and interests of the financial sector and its non-involvement in the development of real production have been formed. Eloquent illustrations of this circumstance are provided by the Izvestia newspaper. The dollar began to grow again, 3rd of the 2nd, 2004. The central bank will offer an instrument to prevent this money from entering the economy, not because it wants to harm the economy, but because it is responsible for inflation. And other departments are responsible for the development of the economy and doubling the GDP. In other words, divide and conquer. Overcoming these accepted by everyone, vicious stereotypes, is simplified through figurative comparisons. Does the circulatory system, the quantity and quality of blood, affect man's health? Yes, this fully conditions man's health. But after all, the functions performed in the national economic complex by the financial credit system and the country's money fully correspond to the functions performed by the hematopoietic and circulatory system, by the blood of man's organism. The analogy here is surprisingly accurate. Blood brings to every part of man's organism an amount of oxygen proportional to its power and development needs and carries away an equivalent amount of carbon dioxide. In the same way, only money can bring to every enterprise of the national economic complex resources for development proportional to its capacity, raw materials, energy resources, and carry away from it goods. The amount of money, blood, should be strictly proportional to the scale of the system served. If there is not enough money and the system is drained of blood, then all its parts without exception will inevitably be out of order. The head is science, the legs are the agrarian sector, the hands are industry, and so on. Even former Prime Minister M.M. Kasyanov noted the catastrophic loss of blood in our national economy. The banking sector assets in our country account for only 40% of the GDP. In developed Western countries, banking sector assets amount to 400% of the GDP. In Central and Eastern Europe, 100% of the GDP. Rossiyskaya Gazeta, 2nd of the 12th, 2004. Thus, the solution to the basic task of doubling the GDP lies outside the sphere of real production and is connected with the fundamental changes in the system of monetary circulation, with a transition to a new scientific methodology of relations between the financial credit system of our country, with the world's financial credit system, and with the real production sector. It is known that it's impossible to detect methodological system errors if the researcher remains within the framework of the system under consideration and does not abandon his initial postulates. On this occasion, back in 1931, the Austrian mathematician and logician K. Gödel proved the incompleteness theorem named after him. We have a current analytical note devoted to the revision of the initial, now dominant stereotypes, the formation of a new methodology of economic development. Number 1. Money and profit from the emission of money as an instrument of real governance, transition from gold to energy standard of the backing of currencies. The key to governing any country to real, but not nominal, is the right to emission and direct or indirect governance towards its money. The country may de jure consider itself independent, but de facto it will be a financial colony under a currency board on the part of the metropolis affecting the emission of money and its circulation. Over the past 13 years, inflation has outpaced the growth of the money supply by 10 times, sharply disrupting the proportions between the availability of money and the technological needs for it. In terms of the level of monetization, the ratio of M2 to GDP, Russia was purpose-orientedly lowered to one of the last places in the world. The loss of blood became the root cause of the collapse of all branches of the production sector, and the deliberately created ruble vacuum is intended to be replaced with the dollar and other monetary surrogates. To create a financial atmosphere viable for the real sector of production, it is necessary to talk not about the development of the banking sector. As pointed out by the Prime Minister, it can develop only on account of the further transfer of finance from production through interest on loans. The restoration of the functionally necessary proportions money-GDP is required as a one-time, albeit protracted, operation for blood transfusion. The emission of development should be targeted, should pay off state debts, develop high-tech production, and eliminate screaming social problems. The total money supply should be brought up to match the capacities and technological needs of the national economic complex and be backed by our basic products, but not at all by gold and foreign exchange reserves. The need for money and its amount should not change, even if there is no single gram of gold, no single dollar in the country. The donor for the blood transfusion should be the treasury of the Russian Federation, which, eliminating the artificially created deficit, is obliged to emit into circulation approximately 5 times the amount of state treasury notes in relation to the amount of Bank of Russia banknotes that are in circulation. The initial basis for the emission of treasury notes is budgetary demand, the availability of goods from producers, and therefore treasury notes should be emitted on behalf of the state represented by the government. The income from their circulation should become the income of the state. The treasury notes must be circulated in the country on a par with the banknotes of the Bank of the Russian Federation, as it was in our statehood before 1990. Another thing is that money must be governed in a qualified manner, avoiding inflation. For this, the volume of treasury notes, after the elimination of the deficit, must grow strictly in proportion to the increasing GDP. The essence of the methodology of governance towards a particular state is largely determined by the content of inscriptions and pictures on banknotes accepted for circulation. Presently, the emission is carried out mainly at the request of exporters of raw materials, sellers of the currency. All other sectors of the economy operate in conditions of double-digit interest rates that do not have a budget for development, at 1 to 2% per annum, and therefore have to reorient themselves to the country's only solvent customer, the raw material sector. This predetermines exclusively the raw material orientation of the country's economy and exclusively the foreign exchange backing of the issuance. In the leading countries of the world, the budget is the main center for the supply of financial resources and the provision of monetary emission. And it is the budget that sets the priorities and shapes the direction of the country's development. These state priorities also stimulate the corresponding development of related sectors and the country's cadre base. Only 3% of the monetary base of the Japanese yen is backed by gold and foreign exchange reserves, and 71% by budget requests and corresponding guarantees in the form of state securities. The monetary base of the dollar is 7% and 92% respectively. Questions of Economics magazine dated 2003, number 12. It should be borne in mind that the emission procedure provides the so-called seigniorage, which the Economic Encyclopedia defines as the profit generated in the form of the difference between the nominals of the monetary unit and the cost of its production. On the $100 bill, it goes up to $99.9. Seigniorage, by its very nature, is the property of the real production sector, since the emission of money is carried out for the backing of the mass of goods it produces. However, these astronomical profits in our country are not the property of all the people in the person of the state, but of a private corporation, which de facto the central bank is. That is why, having registered with a modest authorized capital of 3 million rubles, it earned only gold and foreign exchange reserves in the amount of more than $80 billion. The repeated statements of the president of the country on the issue of nationalization of the central bank were skillfully, and apparently for vested interest, chatted up in Parliament. Let us touch in more detail on the issues of the nature of money and their standard of backing. As you know, from the moment of its inception up to 1971, money at its core was always a commodity that was most often used in product exchange operations. A special place among commodity money was occupied by grain, livestock, precious metals. This commodity acted as an absolute measure of value, an invariant in the price current for all other commodities and goods. Banknotes, by their nature, are a certificate note of the bank about the presence, in the country issuing these banknotes, of goods equivalent to their nominal value. The last World Agreement, Bretton Woods 1944, established the gold standard for the backing of currencies. $35 was equal to 31.1 grams of gold, and all other currencies were pegged to the dollar. At the same time, at least de jure, the uniformity of measurements in product exchange operations was ensured, since the absolute exchange rate of any currency had been established. However, in 1971, US President R. Nixon unilaterally issued a decree that stopped the exchange of dollars for gold. From that moment on, all world currencies without exception lost their connection with the standard, with the invariant commodity, lost their scale, their absolute value, retaining only conditional relative relations among themselves. In the 20th century, radical changes took place in production of goods, and a change from biogenic to technogenic, when up to 95% of goods are produced on the basis of not biogenic, muscular, but technogenic energy. Technogenic energy acts as a de facto invariant of goods, regardless of whether we want to admit it or not. Try to compare the cost of a loaf of bread, bricks, aluminium ingots. You will understand that this can only be done by calculating the energy consumptions connected with their extraction and production. If we really want to egress from the impasse of the metrological inconsistency of the economy, then it's necessary to resolve the issue of a legislative transition to an energy standard for the backing up of currencies, to the de jure pegging of a kilowatt-hour as an invariant in the price current for all types of goods. At the same time, we must define the ruble as a unit of measurement of value, numerically equal to a certain number of kilowatt-hours of electricity, set according to discretion. Given the current electricity prices, 1 ruble should be equated to 1 kilowatt-hour of electricity. This discretionarily pegged ratio will be the energy standard for the ruble's backing. Herewith, at the first stage, the currently accepted price scale would practically be preserved, but the ruble would receive an unambiguous concrete content, easily recalculated, including into the volumes of other energy carriers, oil, gas, and so on. The strategic advantage, investment attractiveness, demand for its currency abroad will be received by the country that will be the first to offer the world money de jure backed on the basis of the energy standard. It should be noted that as the energy ruble is introduced, the Ministry of Energy should become a direct participant in the implementation of the country's emissional monetary policy. The volumes of emission should be coordinated with the produced mass of goods, and therefore with the volumes of energy consumed by the production complex of the country. The volume of energy consumed in the country should be strictly taken into account and laid down as a basic parameter in the development of monetary, financial credit, emissional policy of our state. The formation of orderly, metrologically consistent relations in the monetary system will remove all existing financial constraints in accelerating the pace of our development, will lead to active investment participation of foreign companies, as there will be an increased interest in entering the country where one can earn backed by goods, stable currency. On our banknotes, in contrast to the dollar and the euro, there should appear a juridical guarantee of their commodity, energy coverage, a specific numerical value of the ruble in kilowatt hours of electric energy. 2. Methodology of socially useful monetary circulation, external convertibility of the ruble. The emission of money on the basis of the energy standard is only the basis for the transition to a system of socially useful monetary circulation. Initially, money arose for the sake of simplifying the exchange of goods, and this is precisely its socially useful mission today. However, in the course of its development, the system of monetary circulation gave rise to such an alien to social interests phenomenon as usury, that is, spontaneously established growth of money supply up to 210% per year, due to its provision on an interest rate basis. Cash incomes to the real sector of production are based on the transfer to society of this or that good that has a corresponding consumer value. The self-growth of money on the basis of usury generates colossal incomes which are not backed by any goods, and therefore cause inflation, a disbalance in the national economic complex. This led to a regeneration of the nature of money, which was not revealed in the lexicon, to the emergence of a qualitatively new type of money, generated, without connection with production, by the numbers on banknotes. This type of money has other parents. By its very nature, it has no commodity backing. Inflation is an inevitable attribute accompanying its appearance, since interest payments of the production sector are attributed to the cost price, and inevitably increase the cost of manufactured goods. In addition, money conditioned not by goods but by growth also appears within the financial credit system itself, outside of connection with goods production. This self-expansion of the money supply is linked to the central bank's base rate and inevitably generates inflation. On this occasion, it's enough to give just one example. By the middle of 1998, with an M2 money supply of about 370 billion rubles, the volume of the GKO market, short-term zero-coupon government bonds, was over 300 billion and worked as a powerful generator of inflationary pumping of insane income. For every dollar imported into Russia at that time, Western capital took out $4 of income from this financial pyramid. The number one problem in the currently dominant system of monetary circulation is loan interest, destabilizing the economy, which should be prohibited by law. The banking sector, as a service sector, should receive income proportional to the quantity and quality of its labor, or as a share of income jointly received in the production sector. Popular coverage of some aspects of interest-free money circulation is presented in the book by M. Kennedy, with a telling title, Interest and Inflation-Free Money, Creating an Exchange Medium that Works for Everybody and Protects the Earth. The vicious methodology of usury is borrowed by our country from the Western biblical civilization. The Quran, Surah 2, categorically prohibits usury, the receipt of income outside the sphere of creation. That is why, over the years of perestroika, the mechanisms of internal usury led to a murderous outflow of finance and incomes from the sphere of real production into the banking sector. And international superstate usury hooked the country on the needle of external borrowing. The operation was based on the deliberate contraction of our country's money supply by 10 times. External debt in the form of paper and numbers in a computer led the country to disastrous payments of debts and interest costs up to 40% of the country's budget. At the same time, the greater part of the dollar debts, for so to say incomprehensible reasons, turned out to be converted into the growing euro. The metrological inconsistency of the system of world currencies makes it possible not only to manipulate the volume of external debt, but also to introduce into practice schemes of equivalent commodity exchange. Russian exports are about 2 times higher than imports. That is, we carry out unprecedented, in terms of proportions, commodity lending to the outside world, and above all to the United States. In response to this, almost all new dollar cash went to Russia in the proportion of 1 kilogram of paper in $100 bills for 10 kilograms of gold. We have one of the highest degrees of dollarization of the economy in the world, 10% of cash dollars of the GDP. And only at the beginning of this year did the increasing ruble cash equal the dollar at the exchange rate. According to The Economist magazine, the ruble is one of the most humiliated currencies in the world. According to the standard set of 25 food products, the ruble is undervalued in relation to the dollar by more than 2 times. According to various estimates, due to the absence of the absolute scale of currencies, the real exchange rate of the ruble in relation to the Western currencies is undervalued by 2 to 4 times. This enables them to conduct non-equivalent commodity exchanges, have cheap costs on the territory of Russia, and carry out non-equivalently expensive sales at home. It's possible to list other absurdities of international commodity-money relations, but the given particular examples are enough to draw conclusions about the absence of random errors in the money circulation system, about their methodological commonality, deliberate infringement of the interests of our statehood, the creation of justified by nothing, unilateral advantages for the so-called developed countries. However, this is not actually hidden. In the verbose and meaningless Strategy for the Development of the Banking Sector, which has just been submitted for discussion by the government, we read that its objective is to create a banking sector that corresponds to international ideas about modern banking business. Kommersant newspaper, February the 11th, 2004. But not at all to our social interests. The essence of international ideas is clear from the above facts and boils down to the creation of unilateral advantages. The restoration of elementary common sense in building our foreign commodity money relations should begin with a unified unit of account, the energy ruble. In this case, it's necessary to adhere to elementary common sense. On average, the volume of the commodity, goods and products, mass of exports and imports should be equal. Accordingly, the paper and electronic cash flow to our country should be balanced by the counterflow of information, but not the flow of goods. The foreign trade balance makes it possible to smoothly transition exports to the ruble zone. This requires a law similar to the one in force in Japan since 1949, prohibiting the sale of their goods for someone else's, especially de jure unbacked currency. Otherwise, everything is turned upside down, and expensive oil is considered a problem for Russia. Expensive oil is a blessing for us, and the only problem is that we receive not goods for it, but an endless flow of paper that destabilizes the economy. But the way out is obvious. We have to start selling our resources for rubles, and the ruble will cease to put pressure on the domestic market, will be involved in the external circulation, settle not in our country, but in the countries of Europe, Asia, and America, living on our resources. Only in such a scheme can the President's message regarding the external convertibility of the ruble be realized. The foreign trade balance of Russia, the double excess of exports over imports, creates the basis for a colossal demand for rubles, for the possibility of selling them for any currency we need for import operations. On the other hand, importers will be ready for sales to Russia for rubles, either for counter purchases of goods in Russia or for trade with countries that consume our energy resources. Thus, the transition of exports to the ruble zone, the introduction of the energy ruble into circulation, and its external convertibility are interdependent processes. Demand for rubles, i.e., their external convertibility, will be ensured if goods appear in international trade, including energy resources, which will be impossible to buy for any money other than Russian rubles. Only in this scheme does the country's money become commodity-backed. Today, our energy resources are in the backing of the dollar. The demand for it is connected, among other things, with the possibilities of purchasing Russian goods for this paper. In the current prevailing stereotypes, the inflation process is taken as something natural. The postulate of the inevitability of inflation serves as a cover not only for intrastate schemes of destructive intersectoral imbalance, but also schemes of inequivalent interstate exchange. Upon closer examination, it becomes obvious that the basis of world inflation is the fact that the G7 countries annually print about $1 trillion of not backed by commodity so-called hard currency. Only sophisticated experts know that there is such a difference between the growth of so-called factual world gross product and the growth of its value in dollar terms. This makes it possible to export oil, timber, gas, gold from our country without counter-commodity coverage. The inflation screen is also applied at the domestic level, when schemes for the redistribution of income from the processing industry sector to raw materials extractors and to the financial sector are implemented. It all starts with the fact that sly governors prognose inflation of 10% for the next year. For those who understand questions of governance, it is obvious that in reality, we aren't dealing with prognosing, but with programming. It is towards this pseudo-prognosing that a jump in prices for goods and services of natural monopolies, for the bread of the industry, electricity, under this prognosis the double-digit refinancing rate of the central bank, destructive for industrialists, is kept. And then it is these aforementioned parameters that generate the inevitable rise in prices of any other product, and hence inflation. However, the growth in prices for the final product lags at least 5 times behind the growth in prices for raw materials due to the absence of solvent demand from the population, and is, in essence, an investment resource. After all, the share of wages in our country is no more than 20% of the GDP. In developed countries, 60%. In the USA, 70%. This has formed intersectoral imbalances that are unacceptable for the integrity of the state. When the labor of the grain grower, miner, machine builder is catastrophically devalued against the background of the labor of bankers and raw materials extractors. In Russia, 1 kilogram of bread is equal in price to 1 liter of gasoline, and in the USA, to 5 liters of gasoline. The average monthly salary in Russia is 400 liters of gasoline, and in the USA, 5,700 liters. We can say anything, but with such proportions, bread-gasoline, sooner or later, the field will not be ploughed. What kind of normal competition between our processors within the WTO can be spoken of if they receive a credit resource at 15 to 20% per annum, while in Japan it is strictly 0, in the USA 1%, and not much higher in Europe. But loan interest, generating inflation, abides in the cost of any product of the country, including raw materials, in the tariffs of natural monopolies, in utilities, and consequently in the goods of those producers who have never taken out credit loans. The imposed stereotypes that the central bank's base rate is conditioned by high inflation, this is a deliberate substitution of cause by effect. In accordance with this logic, it can just as reasonably be asserted that the strength of the wind is determined by the amplitude of the movement of the branches on the trees. This conclusion will have, exactly the same as in the case of inflation, indisputable confirmation in practice. Number 3. The roots of inflation and criteria for inflation-free economic development, unequivalent, intersectoral and interstate exchange as instruments of collapse of the national economic complex. Is it possible to get rid of inflation, to introduce into practice a constant decline in prices? Sure. We are ready to give a conception of such an economy. It was such schemes that worked in the post-war years, when prices dropped every month, and L. Earhart noted quite accurately, inflation is not a law of development, but the work of fools who govern the state. An inflation-free economy is based on a legislative ban on usury, loan interest, a metrologically justified emission of monetary resources for commodity coverage, and a legislative ban on the revision of tariffs of natural monopolies. The monetary component of the working capital of industrial production was practically zeroed out through an unprecedented jump in prices. its replenishment went exclusively through a credit resource, the price of which reached 210% per annum, with income from the turnover per year, for example, in the agricultural sector, of a few percent. With a spasmodic increase in the loan rate, this can be proved mathematically rigorously, the inflation process is inevitably accelerated, and the sectors with a long period of capital turnover are the first to drop out of the assembly of the national economic complex. The reserves of the central bank, with a modest authorized capital of 3 million rubles at the beginning of the liberal reforms that was formed from profits, as already shown earlier, have exceeded $80 billion to date, and the debt, for example, of agricultural producers for the same period more than 10 times exceeded the balance sheet profit of the entire agricultural sector and is absolutely unrealistic to pay back. The intersectoral imbalance has reached devastating proportions for the unity of the country, when only the annual profits of commercial banks are at least 2 times higher than the total debt of the village. But if you look at the consolidated balance sheet of the national economic complex, it becomes obvious that the profits of one of its sectors are precisely the losses of another. We must admit that when the government decides to compensate the villages for 2/3 of the refinancing rate on credit loans provided, then we are talking about helping bankers, not agricultural producers, who, with the profitability of their farms of about 4%, even theoretically cannot pay a double-digit loan interest. Now a lot of attention is paid to the prices of bread, but at the same time, no one talks about the structure of the cost of bread. Oil products, plowing, harvesting grain, railway and automobile tariffs, transportation of grain, flour and bread, electricity, elevators, mills, bakeries, and of course, the loan interest hanging over the entire credit-intensive seasonal chain. All that remains is the salary, on which apparently it is proposed to save. If all the components of the cost of bread are growing, then the containment of prices of bread is an underpayment for the labor of the grain grower and a grave cross on the development of the entire sector. We need to fight not with natural consequences, but with root causes. We need a legislative ban on the growth of tariffs, on the collection of falsely justified loan interest. During the years of perestroika, the growth of the already unbalanced prices for agricultural products lagged at least 5 times behind the growth in prices for services of natural monopolies for industrial products, including products of an agricultural purpose. We are assured that it's necessary to equalize the prices for electricity with the USA, as they are 2 times lower. But at the same time, it's hushed up that the price of bread in our country is 8 rubles, while in the USA it's almost 60 rubles, $2. In these inflationary, intersectoral imbalances, there lies the secret of the rampant ruin of the grain grower and all other spheres of industrial production. In addition to the schemes that work towards ruining the country as a whole, objective-oriented schemes are also used at the international level to solve these problems in relation to the agricultural sector. This is achieved in the following way. As is known, all countries of the world directly provide agriculture with grants, or use indirect grant and support schemes. For example, Japan by 80%, Finland by 70%, the USA at least 40%. This is due to the competition and the struggle for sales markets. The fact is that almost all countries of the world have access to agricultural technologies, in contrast to missile, aviation ones, etc. The sun is the same for everyone, so is the water. Therefore, developed countries deliberately establish price disparities, lowering prices for agricultural products, thereby trying to squeeze out analogous products of a competing country. At the same time, excessive profits arising in other industries, as well as income from unbacked emission, are pumped into agriculture at the state level with the help of special schemes. The leaderships of the countries that are unable to understand this algorithmics and, therefore, do not introduce similar compensation schemes are doomed to reap the collapse of their own national economic complex and the destruction of the food security system. State redistribution of financial flows in favor of agriculture by its nature is not grants. It is more correct to define them as compensations that simply restore the status quo and place the labor of an agricultural producer on a par with the labor in other sectors. Manufacturing, agriculture, the real sectors of production of goods and services are the sources of the GDP doubling, and therefore it's time to stop the murderous bank usury and include tax compensatory mechanisms of market regulation that ensure the balanced development of all sectors of the single national economic complex, excluding intersectoral price and investment imbalances. It is time to dispel the myth of the omnipotence of the possibilities of the market. An unregulated market inevitably tunes itself to maximum profitability when the following prospers: usury, pawn and drug business, alcohol and tobacco producers, that is, those areas that destroy statehood. Sufficiency should be determined by labor, but not by sectoral belonging. Conclusions: acceleration of the country's economic development, external convertibility of the ruble are interconnected tasks and require the following priority measures for its realization. 1. To organize an objective-oriented, non-inflationary emission of development by means of the emission of state treasury notes, circulating on a par with the bills of the Bank of Russia. Thus, we have to bring the volume of the money supply in line with the technological needs for it, pushing out foreign currency from circulation within the country. 2. To legislatively establish state ownership of income from the emission of money, transfer the functioning of the central bank of the Russian Federation to the mode of a budgetary organization with the transfer of the central bank's reserves to the governance of the government. 3. To return the lost commodity form to the money, put into circulation an energy ruble with the establishment of a standard of its energy backing. Thus, ensure the metrological consistency of the system for measuring economic quantities, the uniformity of measurements when conducting domestic and international commodity exchange operations, to apply adequate measures to counter attempts to unjustified acquisition of the world gross product by Western partners through unbacked currency issuance. 4. To ensure non-inflationary stable development of the country on the basis of a strict compliance of the money supply with the technological needs of the national economic complex, its energy supply. To eliminate the replenishment of the cash deficit with the foreign currency and the receipt of the corresponding emissional money income by foreign powers. 5. To introduce a legislative ban on receiving income outside the sphere of creation, on usury. To move to the schemes of interest-free lending to the production sector, to make it so that the banking sector receives income in accordance with the quantity and quality of services provided, or in the mode of investment participation in the incomes of the real sector of the economy. 6. In light of the self-sufficiency of the resource base and high export potential of the country, to exclude the practice of external monetary borrowing on an interest basis from the state policy, and to take measures to fully pay back the external debt. To promote the attraction of foreign capital solely on an investment basis, with income from the scheme of real production of goods or services. 7. To introduce a legislative ban on export deliveries for any currency other than the Russian ruble. To ensure this with the help of its additional treasury emission, sufficient for organizing foreign trade circulation of the ruble, for credit loans to all countries without exception that consume our goods and energy resources. 8. To introduce a legislative ban on destabilizing the national economy by changing the scale of prices through increasing tariffs of natural monopolies, eliminating the prerequisites for the development of inflation. Changing them should be the prerogative of the Parliament and the President. 9. On the basis of the energy standard of currencies, using market levers, and an effective foreign trade policy to achieve the purchasing power parity of the ruble in relation to other currencies. 10. To develop a unified state tax, grant and compensation policy that ensures the balanced development of all sectors of the single national economic complex without exception, relying on a unified measurement system based on the energy ruble, while eliminating intersectoral price imbalances and leveling the investment attractiveness of sectors. 11. To ensure the average statistical equality of export and import commodity flows. To eliminate the schemes of unjustified export commodity crediting of foreign countries which have been working smoothly for more than 10 years. 12. By refusing to supply energy resources for dollars, relying on the natural tendency aimed at the decrease of the exchange rate of the unbacked dollar supply to carry out its timely replacement by the ruble issued by the Treasury. The purchase for rubles dollar cash circulating in the country should be returned to pay back the external debt. At the same time, to categorically exclude the convertibility of dollar external debt into other currencies.